She did not raise her voice, but the entire cafe went quiet anyway. The clink of porcelain stopped. Even the espresso machine seemed to hesitate. People turned because no one spoke to him like that. Not here, not ever. He stood there in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, one hand wrapped around a white ceramic cup, the other holding a folded stack of cash he had clearly not expected to be refused. Her eyes were steady, defiant, almost daring him to respond. This was not how a story with a millionaire was supposed to begin, and everyone in that room felt it. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The argument had started quietly, almost politely, the way disagreements between strangers often do before they turn sharp. She had been standing behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back with a clip that had lost its shine years ago, when he complained that his coffee was cold. She apologized once and offered to remake it. He waved her off and slid the bill across the counter as if that settled everything. She pushed it back. She told him she would remake the coffee because it was her job, not because he could pay her to feel small. That was when his eyebrow lifted, more curious than offended. He was used to boardrooms, to people choosing their words carefully around him, to silence arriving the moment he entered a space. He was not used to a woman in a neighborhood cafe looking him straight in the eye and telling him money did not buy basic decency. A few customers pretended to scroll on their phones, but everyone was listening. He said something about time being valuable. She said so was dignity. The word hung there between them, heavier than any insult. He finally took the coffee, but he did not leave. He sat down at the small table by the window and watched her move, efficient, focused, pretending he no longer existed. Outside, traffic rolled past, ordinary and indifferent. Inside, something had shifted. 10 minutes later, she stepped out from behind the counter to take orders, and he spoke again, quieter this time, asking her name. She hesitated, then gave it, because politeness was not weakness and she knew the difference. He introduced himself with just his first name, nothing else, as if testing what it felt like to be ordinary. When she asked what he did for a living, he said business, vaguely, the way people do when they do not want to be known for it. Their conversation was clipped, edged, two people circling each other with words instead of weapons. She learned he was in town for meetings. He learned she worked 2 jobs and took care of her younger brother. Neither shared more than they intended, but both listened more than they planned to. When he stood to leave, he paused, then did something unexpected. He apologized, not for the coffee, but for assuming. The room exhaled. She nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. What neither of them realized, not yet, was that this brief clash, this small moment of defiance in a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon, had just set something in motion that would follow them into boardrooms, headlines, and a proposal so public it would leave the same people who had watched them argue utterly stunned. By the time the cafe closed that night, she had already replayed the argument in her head a dozen times, not because she regretted what she said, but because something about him unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. It was not his suit or the quiet authority in his voice. It was the way he listened when she pushed back, as if no one had done that to him in a long time. She locked the door, flipped the sign to closed, and counted the register with practiced speed. The numbers mattered. Every dollar mattered. Rent was due in 5 days. Her brother needed new shoes for school. The second job at the grocery store started at 6 the next morning. There was no room in her life for men who looked like they belonged on magazine covers and ordered their problems away with folded cash. Across town, he stood alone in a hotel room that overlooked the city, jacket tossed. Over a chair, tie loosened but not removed. He stared at his phone, unread messages stacking up from his assistant, his legal counsel, his mother. The board meeting tomorrow would be brutal. The merger everyone expected him to announce was stalling, and the rumors had already started. Investors wanted stability. The press wanted a narrative. His family wanted reassurance that he was still in control. What he wanted, though he had not admitted it to himself yet, was the strange calm he had felt in that cafe when someone treated him like a man instead of a balance sheet. The next morning, their paths crossed again, not by coincidence, but by necessity. She was finishing her early shift at the grocery store when her manager pulled her aside and told her there had been a complaint. A man in a suit, polite but firm, asking questions about her schedule, her availability, her other job. By noon, she was standing in the same café, this time not behind the counter, but at the small table by the window, arms crossed, jaw set. He arrived on time. No entourage, no assistant, just him. He explained quickly, not defensively, that he needed someone to accompany him to a series of public events over the next few weeks. Not a date, not exactly. A presence. Someone real. Someone who would not smile on command or crumble under pressure. She laughed once, sharp and humorless, and told him he had the wrong woman. He slid a folder across the table, not money this time, but terms. Clear, limited, almost clinical. Compensation that would cover her rent for 6 months. Flexible hours that would let her keep her other jobs. No physical expectations. No emotional obligations. It was a proposal, not of love, but of survival, and that was what scared her most. She pushed the folder back and stood up, saying she did not sell herself. He did not argue. He only said he respected that, then added quietly that sometimes accepting help was not the same as selling your soul. She walked out, heart pounding, angry at him for offering and angrier at herself for hesitating. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, the folder unopened beside her, listening to her brother breathe in the next room and doing the math she had done too many times before. Pride did not pay bills. Dignity did not keep the lights on. Meanwhile, he stood in front of a wall of glass at his office, watching the city darken, knowing the clock was ticking. The board would not wait. The press would not wait. He needed this arrangement to work, not for appearances alone, but because somewhere along the way, he had lost the ability to trust anyone who did not challenge him. When her phone buzzed just before midnight with a message from him, short and respectful, saying the offer would remain on the table until morning, she stared at it for a long time before typing back a single line. "If I say yes, it is on my terms." He replied almost instantly. Then we might finally be speaking the same language. The next morning, she met him in a conference room that looked nothing like the cafe where they had first argued, all glass and steel and quiet confidence, the kind of room designed to make people feel smaller the moment they sat down. She noticed everything anyway. The view of the city stretching for miles, the untouched bottle of water placed exactly in front of her chair, the way he waited for her to sit first. He did not smile. He did not rush. He slid the folder back across the table, this time opened, and said they should go through it line by line, so there would be no misunderstandings. She told him she did not trust contracts written by people who had more lawyers than friends. He accepted that without offense, and said that was precisely why the terms were simple. There would be a fixed duration, 3 months, no extensions unless both agreed in writing. She would attend specific public events as his partner, nothing private, nothing hidden. She would not be required to lie about her background, only to avoid correcting assumptions unless directly asked. There would be no shared living space, no staged intimacy, no expectations beyond presence and composure. He paused there and looked at her, making sure she heard that last word. Presence, not obedience. She asked about compensation, hating herself a little for how carefully she chose the word. He named the amount calmly, an amount that made her throat tighten despite her effort to stay still. It was more than she made in 6 months working both jobs, more than enough to stabilize her life without changing who she was. She accused him of trying to buy credibility with a human shield. He did not deny it. He said credibility built on illusion collapsed quickly, and what he needed was someone who would not flinch when a room turned cold. She flipped through the pages, noting what was missing as much as what was written. No morality clauses. No penalties for speaking her mind. No requirement to stay silent if she was disrespected. That unsettled her more than any trap would have. She told him she had conditions of her own. He nodded and picked up a pen, waiting. First, she said, no surprises. If a situation could embarrass her or put her family at risk, she would know in advance. Second, she would not be used as a prop against anyone else. No jealous rivals, no political games. Third, if at any point she felt this arrangement crossed a line, she would walk away with no retaliation. He agreed to all 3 without negotiation, writing them in by hand, initialing each one. The sound of the pen scratching paper felt heavier than a signature. When they reached the final page, she hesitated, staring at the blank line where her name would go. This was the moment where everything could tilt, where dignity and desperation wrestled in silence. He did not push the pen toward her. He did not tell her time was running out. He only said that whatever she decided, he respected it, and that respect would not disappear if she chose no. That, more than the money, broke her resistance. She signed. The room did not change, but something inside her did, a tightening mixed with a strange, unwelcome sense of relief. He signed after her, then closed the folder and stood, extending his hand. She shook it, firm and brief, the way she did with suppliers and managers, not lovers. This is not real, she reminded him, as much for herself as for him. He answered just as quietly that he knew, and that pretending would be the easy part. As she left the building, contract tucked into her bag like a secret she was not ready to share, she did not feel triumphant. She felt alert, aware that she had stepped into a world that would test every line she had just drawn. Upstairs, he remained by the window long after she was gone, looking down at the street where ordinary lives moved without strategy or scrutiny, knowing that this agreement was already more dangerous than any deal he had signed before, because it was built not on leverage, but on choice. The first week of the arrangement moved faster than she expected, as if the contract itself had set the pace. It started with clothes, not as a makeover fantasy, but as logistics. A stylist met her in a quiet showroom and asked practical questions about where she shopped, how she moved, what made her uncomfortable. When the stylist suggested heels that pinched her toes, she said no, flat and unapologetic, and the woman nodded as if that answer mattered. He watched from a chair near the window, saying very little, only intervening once when someone tried to describe her as needing refinement. She does not need fixing, he said calmly, and the room adjusted around that statement. Their first public appearance was a charity luncheon, all white tablecloths and practiced smiles. She walked beside him, not clinging, not trailing, her posture straight, her expression neutral. When someone assumed she was impressed by the room, she corrected them by asking about the organization's impact metrics. He almost smiled then, caught himself, and looked away. The car rides between events became their battleground. She challenged the way he spoke about people as assets. He challenged her assumption that wealth erased responsibility. Their arguments were controlled but sharp, words chosen carefully, both refusing to back down. Yet there were moments that slipped through the cracks. When a donor spoke down to her, he did not interrupt, but his jaw tightened, and later he quietly ensured that donor was no longer on the guest list for future events. When he snapped at an assistant under pressure, she waited until they were alone and told him that power did not excuse carelessness. He listened, not defensively, not immediately agreeing, but listening. By the second week, the press had noticed. Articles speculated about where she came from, what she represented, whether she was a calculated distraction or a genuine shift. She read none of it. He read everything. At a gala one evening, a woman with a sharp smile asked her how it felt to be temporary. The room leaned in. She answered evenly that everything meaningful in life was temporary if you did not protect it. He felt the weight of that sentence long after the music resumed. Their routine settled into something almost stable. Events, rehearsed entrances, controlled exits. Late nights, early mornings. No touching beyond what was required for the cameras. No shared meals unless scheduled. Yet familiarity crept in through small habits. He learned she drank black coffee because sugar reminded her of scarcity. She learned he loosened his tie when he was thinking, not when he was tired. One night, after a particularly tense board reception, the car stalled in traffic, rain streaking the windows. The silence stretched. He finally admitted that he hated how easily people confused his calm with cruelty. She said she hated how easily people mistook her refusal to be impressed for ingratitude. They sat with that, the city blurred outside, neither reaching for the other, but both recognizing something fragile forming in the space between words. The clashes did not stop. If anything, they sharpened, but they also began to carry a strange respect. When she challenged him publicly during a panel, disagreeing with his stance on labor policy, the audience froze. He paused, then adjusted his answer, acknowledging her point without undermining her. Later, he told her she had nearly derailed the narrative. She told him the narrative deserved it. Instead of anger, he laughed, surprised by himself. By the end of the month, what had started as performance felt heavier, more consequential. They were still playing roles, still bound by ink and clauses, but the lines between act and instinct blurred. She knew this was dangerous. He knew it too, and neither of them said it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting that what was supposed to be fake was starting to demand something real. The test came at a fundraising gala that was supposed to be routine, another ballroom filled with polished shoes and rehearsed generosity, another night where appearances mattered more than outcomes. She knew something was different the moment they arrived. The air felt tighter, conversations pausing just a second too long as eyes tracked her dress, elegant but unbranded, her posture calm but unyielding. He sensed it too, the subtle shift that meant scrutiny had sharpened into judgment. During dinner, a senior donor leaned across the table and asked her where she had studied, the question coded in politeness and expectation. When she answered honestly, naming a community college and then a pause while she worked to support her family, the donor smiled thinly and said that ambition was admirable, but pedigree mattered in circles like this. The table went quiet. She felt the old heat rise, the instinct to defend, to explain, to apologize for existing where she did not belong. Instead, she breathed and asked the donor how much of the evening's funds were earmarked for direct impact versus administrative costs. The donor blinked, unprepared, and fumbled an answer. She followed up, precise and respectful, asking how the organization measured outcomes for the communities it claimed to serve. Around them, heads turned. He watched, heart pounding, knowing that one wrong step could fracture weeks of careful positioning. She did not look to him for rescue. She did not soften her tone. She kept it clean, factual, grounded. When the donor finally laughed it off and changed the subject, the room exhaled, but the line had already been crossed. Later, during the speeches, a board member took the stage and made a pointed remark about tradition, stability, and partners who understood the weight of legacy. The implication landed like a challenge. Cameras panned. Whispers rippled. He felt the familiar pressure to control the narrative, to smooth it over with charm. Before he could stand, she did. She did not grab the microphone. She waited until it was offered, then thanked the organizers and spoke about accountability, about how legacy without responsibility was theater, and how stability was not preserved by excluding voices that asked hard questions. She spoke as herself, not as his partner, not as a prop, but as someone who understood consequences because she lived with them every day. The applause was hesitant at first, then steady, then real. He stood beside her, not leading, not shielding, simply present, and for the first time he understood what the contract had never captured. After the gala, the backlash arrived quickly. Messages from advisors warned him that donors were unsettled, that board members were unhappy, that she had overstepped. He listened, thanked them, and ended the calls. In the car, the city lights slid past as silence filled the space. She apologized once, not for speaking, but for not warning him. He told her not to apologize. He told her that she had done what he could not, said what he had been trained to avoid, and that the room had needed to hear it. She studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden resentment. There was none, only resolve. The next morning, headlines framed the moment as a rift, a bold challenge, a misstep. He released a statement standing by her remarks and announcing a review of funding practices. The phones exploded. So did his inbox. She expected him to pull back, to renegotiate boundaries, to remind her of clauses and optics. Instead, he invited her to the office and asked her to help draft the next steps. That was when she realized the test had not been about surviving judgment. It had been about choosing alignment when it cost something. By afternoon, the board called an emergency session. He walked into the room with her at his side, not introduced, not hidden. When questioned, he said plainly that leadership without challenge was performance, and that he would rather be criticized for evolving than praised for standing still. Some faces hardened. Others softened. The decision would not be unanimous, and he knew it. As they left, she asked him if this was what he had expected when he made the offer. He said no, and then admitted that it was better. She nodded, aware that this choice, this public stand, had shifted the ground beneath them both. The arrangement was still on paper. The risks were now shared, and the line between standing in for him and standing with him had quietly disappeared. The quiet arrived unexpectedly, not after an argument or a headline, but late one night when the city finally slowed enough to let them hear their own thoughts. The office floor was nearly empty, lights dimmed, the glass walls reflecting two figures who looked composed from a distance and exhausted up close. They had stayed late to review notes from the board session, not because it was required, but because neither of them was ready to return to a life that suddenly felt slightly out of sync. She stood by the window, shoes off, feet aching, watching traffic crawl below like a living diagram of patience. He loosened his tie and set it on the table without thinking, a habit she had learned to read as the sign of something heavier than fatigue. He broke the silence first, not with strategy, but with an admission. He said that standing beside her in that room earlier had been the first time in years he had not felt alone in a decision. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. She did not respond right away. She asked instead if he always carried the weight alone. He shrugged, then stopped, realizing how easily that gesture had replaced an answer he had never practiced giving. He told her that leadership had taught him control, not closeness, that every vulnerability became leverage in the wrong hands, and that trust was a luxury he had learned to budget carefully. She nodded, understanding more than he expected. She told him that she did not distrust wealth itself, only the way it often demanded gratitude instead of respect, and that growing up counting dollars had taught her to guard her pride, because it was the one thing no one could repossess. The conversation moved slowly, deliberately, as if both of them were stepping across thin ice, careful not to rush the cracks. He admitted that the contract had been easier than honesty, that paper created boundaries he could manage, while feelings did not. She said the agreement had felt safer than hope, because hope had a history of disappointing her when it mattered most. Neither reached for the other. Neither needed to. The closeness came from recognition, not touch. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the windows, softening the city into something less sharp. He offered to have a car take her home. She declined, then hesitated, then asked if they could sit a little longer. He agreed without checking the time. They spoke about small things then, about coffee preferences and childhood routines, about the difference between being seen and being understood. When she laughed at something he said, a quiet, unguarded sound, he felt something shift, a warmth that unsettled him because it was not tied to achievement or approval. He confessed that he had never planned to marry, not out of cynicism, but because partnerships felt incompatible with the pace and exposure of his life. She told him she had never planned to depend on anyone, not because she wanted to be alone, but because dependency had once cost her more than she could afford. The honesty did not resolve anything. It complicated it. When the clock finally pushed past midnight, she slipped her shoes back on and thanked him for the conversation, not as a courtesy, but as an acknowledgement. He walked her to the elevator and stopped short of saying something that hovered just behind his teeth. The doors closed, leaving him alone with the reflection of a man who had just allowed himself to be known. In her apartment, she lay awake longer than she should have, replaying the night, aware that what had begun as an arrangement had crossed into territory without clauses or protections. Neither of them named it. Neither of them promised anything. But both understood that a line had been crossed, not with a kiss or a confession, but with the quiet realization that they were no longer pretending not to care. The collapse did not come quietly. It arrived wrapped in urgency and accusation, the kind that leaves no room for calm explanations. It began with a message forwarded to her phone early in the morning, an article framed as an exposé, suggesting that her presence had been calculated from the start, that the recent stance on funding reforms was nothing more than a smokescreen for a private deal designed to shield him from regulatory pressure. The piece quoted unnamed sources, implied compensation beyond the contract, and painted her as both pawn and accomplice. She read it once, then again, the words settling like grit in her chest. By the time she reached the office, the building was already buzzing, staff avoiding her eyes, conversations stopping when she passed. He was in a closed meeting, doors sealed, voices tight inside. She waited, not because she wanted to confront him, but because walking away without answers felt like surrender. When the doors finally opened, advisors poured out, faces drawn. He followed, saw her, and understood immediately that something had broken. She held up her phone and asked him if he had known this was coming. He told her no, that the narrative was wrong, that someone was trying to fracture momentum before the next board vote. She asked him if he had anticipated it anyway, if this had always been part of the risk he was willing to let her absorb. He said he had underestimated how far they would go. That was not the answer she needed. The argument escalated quickly, not loud, but sharp, every sentence landing with intention. She accused him of hiding behind her again, of letting her stand in the line of fire while he calculated outcomes. He accused her of assuming malice where there was misjudgment. She reminded him that power did not get to call harm accidental when the consequences were predictable. He said the contract covered media response and legal support. She said the contract did not cover dignity. The words cut deeper than either expected. In a conference room that had witnessed mergers and ultimatums, they finally stopped performing control. She told him she would not be collateral, that whatever feelings had blurred the lines were now liabilities he had failed to protect. He told her that he had trusted her to understand the stakes, that standing beside him meant weathering storms. She answered that storms chosen without consent were betrayal. Silence followed, heavy and final. She reached into her bag and placed the contract on the table, the pages slightly worn from being carried too long. She said she was done, not renegotiating, not pausing, done. He looked at the document as if it were something fragile he had already broken once. He asked her to wait, to let him fix it, to issue a correction, to hold the line for 48 hours. She shook her head. She said she had spent her life holding lines for people who promised later. She would not do it again. When she left, she did not look back. The building seemed colder without her, quieter in a way that felt accusatory. He stood alone, the reflection in the glass unfamiliar, realizing that every instinct to manage, to contain, to outmaneuver had failed him at the moment it mattered most. The fallout was immediate. The board demanded distance. Advisors urged damage control. Headlines reframed the story again, now as a rupture. He complied outwardly, issued statements about mutual decisions and professional boundaries, but the language tasted hollow. That night, he returned to his apartment and sat in the dark, the city glowing indifferently outside. Across town, she packed away the clothes borrowed for events, returned what was not hers, and folded the rest with care, as if order could restore what had been shaken. She told herself she had done the right thing, that walking away preserved the one thing she could not afford to lose. Still, when she turned off the light, the quiet felt heavier than before, because this time the loss was not imagined. It was chosen, and somewhere between pride and pain, both of them understood that the fight had not been about the contract at all, but about whether love, once invited, could survive the machinery of power. The decision came not from a meeting or an advisor, but from a moment of stillness that followed a night he barely slept. He read the article again, then the contract she had left behind, then the messages he had never sent because they sounded too careful even in his own head. For the first time, he understood that every move he had made to protect outcomes had cost him the one thing he had not known how to fight for openly. By morning, he canceled the damage control plan, postponed the board vote, and instructed his legal team to prepare a full disclosure, not a defense. The gala scheduled for that evening, the one meant to reassure donors and quiet speculation, would go on as planned. What would change was his role in it. When the ballroom filled, the atmosphere was tense, expectant. The press was there. The board was there. People whispered about the absence everyone noticed. He arrived alone, no partner at his side, and that absence spoke louder than any headline. Midway through the program, instead of yielding the stage to the next speaker, he stepped forward and asked for the microphone. The room settled into silence. He did not begin with apologies polished by counsel. He began with ownership. He said that the recent controversy had revealed not manipulation, but a failure of courage, that he had asked someone to stand beside him without fully standing with her when the cost became real. He acknowledged the contract openly, not as a shield, but as evidence of where he had hidden instead of choosing honestly. Faces shifted. Cameras adjusted. Then he did something no one expected. He called her name. There was a murmur, a ripple of confusion, and then she appeared at the back of the room, having come only because she had been told the statement would close the chapter cleanly. She froze when she realized what was happening. He did not look away from her as she walked forward, every step heavy with memory and resolve. When she reached the stage, he did not take her hand. He faced the room first and said that he was ending the arrangement publicly and irrevocably, that there would be no revisions, no extensions, no quiet settlements. He tore the copy of the contract in half and placed it on the podium. Then he turned to her. His voice lowered, steadier now. He said that what had begun as a calculation had become a choice he was finally willing to make without protection. He said that she had challenged him not because she wanted power, but because she respected responsibility, and that he loved her not for standing in the spotlight, but for walking away when it dimmed her worth. The room felt suspended, breath held collectively. He reached into his pocket and removed a simple ring, unbranded, unremarkable by industry standards, chosen because it did not perform. He went down on one knee, not as a spectacle, but as an act that could not be undone. He asked her to marry him, not as a partner for optics, not as a symbol, but as an equal who could say no and still be respected. Shock rippled outward, audible, visible. This was not on the program. Cameras flashed. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the torn contract, at the faces watching, at the man kneeling without armor. She asked him one question, quietly, whether this choice would stand even if the board walked away and the headlines turned. He said yes without hesitation. He said he would rather lose control than lose truth. The silence stretched, then broke as she nodded once, not smiling yet, but certain. She said yes. The applause that followed was not polished or polite. It was raw, surprised, uneven, the sound of a room recalibrating its expectations. He stood, placed the ring on her finger with care, and for the first time did not look to see who was watching. In that moment, the story changed, not because of romance alone, but because a man known for control had chosen vulnerability in public, and a woman who had refused to be managed had accepted love on terms that honored her voice. What shocked everyone was not the proposal itself, but the way it dismantled every assumption about power, performance, and what choosing someone out loud truly meant. The aftermath did not explode the way headlines predicted. It unfolded quietly, deliberately, as real commitments often do. In the days that followed the gala, statements were released, positions clarified, and consequences absorbed. Some board members resigned. A few donors withdrew. Others stayed, drawn by the clarity of a leader who had finally stopped performing certainty and started practicing it. He accepted the losses without complaint, redirecting resources, restructuring timelines, choosing steadiness over spectacle. She watched from beside him, not behind him, learning that accountability looked different when it was lived instead of promised. They did not rush a wedding. They returned borrowed dresses and canceled interviews. She went back to her routine, her jobs, her brother's school schedule, grounding herself in the life that had shaped her. He met her there, literally, standing in grocery store aisles and waiting in school offices, listening more than he spoke. The ring on her finger drew glances, but she did not explain it to anyone who asked for proof instead of understanding. When they talked about marriage, they did so the same way they had negotiated everything else, honestly and without illusion. They rewrote the contract together, not to bind themselves, but to remind themselves of what they refused to repeat. There would be transparency. There would be shared decisions. There would be no silence that protected comfort at the expense of respect. Months later, they married in a small ceremony attended by people who had earned their place there. No grand venue, no press, no speeches about destiny. She wore a simple dress she chose herself. He wore a suit he already owned. When they exchanged vows, there was no promise to complete or save each other, only a commitment to stand, to listen, and to choose again when it was harder than walking away. The contract that had once defined their arrangement was framed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how far they had come, its torn edge visible, its clauses crossed out by hand. In the quiet that followed, life did not become perfect. Disagreements remained. Power still complicated things. But when conflicts arose, they faced them without retreating into roles. She never stopped challenging him. He never stopped making room for it. The café where they first argued became a place they visited often, sitting at the same small table by the window, ordinary among ordinary people, the space where dignity had first drawn a line neither of them would cross again. When asked later how it began, she said it started with refusing to be bought. When asked what changed him, he said it was learning that love chosen publicly required courage practiced privately. Their story did not end with a proposal. It settled into something quieter and stronger, a partnership built not on contracts or shock, but on the daily work of showing up as equals. And if there was a lesson that lingered for anyone watching, it was this. Real power is not revealed in control or wealth or spectacle, but in the willingness to choose someone with honesty, even when the world is watching, and even when the choice costs you something you once thought you could not live without.